Someone you love is gone. The body is still. The air in the room has changed, and you have no idea what to do next. That feeling of helplessness, that paralysis in the face of death, feels uniquely modern, like something the ancient world wouldn't have had time for, like grief was a luxury your ancestors couldn't afford. But the real answer is far stranger. Because long before hospitals and funeral homes and black suits and sympathy cards, humans were doing something extraordinary with their dead. Something that reveals not just how they thought about death, but how they understood what it meant to be alive. Your relationship with death is ancient. It goes back further than you think. Let's start with a cave in Spain. In 2013, researchers lowering a camera into a shaft called Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, confirmed something that had been debated for decades. At the bottom, buried under nearly 30 feet of sediment, were the remains of at least 28 individuals, all deposited there deliberately, all at roughly the same time, around 430,000 years ago. These were not Homo sapiens. They were a predecessor species, and yet someone had carried their dead to this place. Someone had chosen not to leave them where they fell. Paleoanthropologist Juan Luis Arzuaga, who led the excavation, argued this was one of the earliest known acts of intentional burial in human history. Not ritual in the way we might recognize it, but intentional, purposeful. The dead were being treated as something more than biological waste. That changes everything. Because for a long time, the dominant view was that symbolic thinking, the ability to assign meaning to things beyond their immediate function, was a late development. Something that arrived with modern humans around 50,000 years ago. The so-called creative explosion. Cave paintings, jewelry, carved figurines. But the Pit of Bones tells a different story. It suggests that the impulse to do something with the dead, to mark their passing with more than indifference, is not a product of modern cognition. It may be a feature of what makes us human at all. You carry that impulse right now, it lives in you. Jump forward to the Neanderthals. For decades, they were dismissed as brutish and incapable of complex emotion. Then excavations at Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, first conducted by Ralph Selecki in the 1950s and 1960s, found something unexpected inside a Neanderthal burial site: clusters of pollen from flowering plants. Selecki interpreted this as evidence that the Neanderthals had buried their dead with flowers. Critics have since argued that the pollen may have been carried in by burrowing rodents. The debate is still alive, but something else was found at Shanidar that is harder to explain away. One of the individuals, known as Shanidar 1, had survived to old age despite severe injuries that would have left him incapacitated. A withered arm, a crushed eye socket, healed fractures across his body. He should have died young. Instead, someone fed him. Someone kept him alive. Someone cared for a member of the group who could no longer contribute. That is not the behavior of a creature indifferent to death. That is the behavior of something that understood loss. Now fast forward to the world your ancestors actually lived in, 10,000 years ago. 5,000. The specifics vary wildly by geography and culture, but certain threads appear again and again across civilizations that had no contact with each other. The body had to be treated before it was released. This was not merely hygiene, this was transformation. In ancient Egypt, the process of mummification took 70 days. The organs were removed, the body was packed in natron salt, wrapped in linen, and sealed inside a series of coffins. The goal was not preservation for its own sake, it was resurrection. The body needed to survive intact so the soul, the ka, the ba, the ak, could return to it. Death was not an ending, it was a transition. And your job as the living was to make sure that transition happened correctly. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians believed that the dead descended to the underworld regardless of how they had lived. What mattered was that they were buried properly. An unburied body was a catastrophe. not just for the deceased, but for the family who had failed them. The ghost of the unburied could not rest. It wandered, it haunted. Gilgamesh, mourning his friend Enkidu, refused to let the body be buried for 7 days. He sat with it until a maggot fell from the nose. Only then did he accept what had happened. Grief needed a body to be real. In ancient China, mourning was not a private affair. It was a performance with rules. Elaborate rituals outlined in the Book of Rites specified exactly how long you should grieve based on your relationship to the deceased. A parent, 3 years; a sibling, 1 year. The rituals were designed not to suppress grief, but to structure it, to give sorrow a shape, a duration, a beginning, and an end. Confucian scholar Shunzi wrote in the 3rd century BCE that rituals of mourning were the way human beings transformed the chaos of emotion into something that could be shared, witnessed, and ultimately completed. The structure of grief is a technology. It exists because raw grief is unsustainable. But here is where it gets strange. Because not every ancient culture chose burial. Not every culture chose to keep the body together at all. The Zoroastrians of ancient Persia, a tradition going back at least 3,000 years, believed that a corpse was impure, that burying it would contaminate the earth and water. So they exposed their dead on elevated stone platforms called dakmas, or towers of silence, and let vultures strip the flesh from the bones. Within hours, the body was gone. The bones were collected, placed in a pit, and dissolved by the elements over time. The dead returned not to the earth, but to the sky. In parts of ancient Tibet and regions of the Himalayas, a practice called sky burial achieved something similar. The body was carried to a high mountain site, where it was offered to vultures as an act of generosity. The final gift of the deceased to the living world, a last act of feeding. Death was not an exit. It was a redistribution. The Toraja people of Sulawesi, Indonesia, held, and in some communities still hold, some of the most elaborate death rituals in the world. The deceased might be kept in the family home for weeks, months, even years, dressed, fed symbolic meals, talked to as if still alive. Death was not a single moment, but a process. A gradual transition that required the community's participation to complete. Anthropologist Roxana Watterson, who documented Toraja mortuary practices in the late 20th century, described how the dead remained socially alive until the family could afford the funeral feast that would officially release them. The dead had rights, they had needs, and the living were responsible for meeting them. What does all of this tell you? What is the pattern underneath these wildly different practices? Every single one of them is a refusal. A refusal to accept that death simply ends things. A refusal to let the body and the person it carried disappear without acknowledgement. A refusal to move on without first doing something, marking something, honoring something. Psychologist Thomas Attig, one of the leading theorists of grief, argues that mourning is not about letting go of the dead. It is about learning to carry them differently. The ancient world understood this intuitively. They built their rituals around it. The goal was never to forget. The goal was to transform the relationship from a living presence to a remembered one, from a body to a story, from a person to an ancestor. You do this too. Every time you tell a story about someone who is gone, every time you keep a photograph or visit a grave or light a candle or make the dish they used to make, you are doing something your ancestors recognized as essential. You are refusing to let them simply stop. The pit of bones is 430,000 years old. The instinct it represents is older than language, older than agriculture, older than everything we call civilization. It is the impulse that says, this person mattered, and their mattering does not end because their breathing does. That instinct lives in you. It shaped you before you were born. And tonight, when someone you love crosses your mind for no particular reason, when their face appears unbidden, and something in your chest responds. You are doing exactly what your ancestors did in the dark, in caves and towers and mountain passes, across 400 millennia of human experience. You are refusing to let the dead disappear, and that refusal is not a weakness. It never was. It is the most human thing you do.